We would like to thank our panelists, Professor Duranton, Professor Glaeser, and Professor Rossi-Hansberg, for taking the time to appear here today. Now, to begin, could each of you please spend 5 minutes to introduce your research in that order?
Okay, so should I start? Yeah. So, given the topic today, I wanted to speak briefly for about 5 minutes indeed on very large cities. And so the first question is really, does that even make sense to see, especially in developing countries, with cities which are 5, 10, 15, 20 millions? So being an economist, I tend to think about that as some trade-off versus cost versus what benefits for those places. So I've done some work on both sides, trying to understand both the cost and benefits of cities. So in developing countries, I went to Colombia, starting actually on a policy job, working with the government and eventually gathering data and doing some of that work. So here the idea was not really to try to push the frontier and develop new techniques, but really produce information about trying to estimate those benefits of cities. And I think was a picture that's slowly emerging from my work, but also some work that Ed did in China, India, Brazil, and some other places. Some work that I also did with the World Bank, where trying to look at that for the entire world continent in Latin America. Indeed, we tend to see some agglomeration benefits in those places. The interesting finding that we'd like to confirm and that we'd like to go a little bit further about is whether or not those agglomeration benefits are indeed stronger in those places. It seems to be the case, but we'd like to see more. It seems like as for countries that are poorer, the benefits from being well together are even larger. So that's something really interesting, I think, for future research, well to confirm. On the cost side, I think I've invested a little bit more and tried to do things that were more novel. So the cost of cities, first, it's a complicated set of issues because the cost of cities, it's many of them. You know, there might be some amenity cost in terms of pollution. There might be some housing cost where housing indeed in larger places tends to be more expensive. And there's also some cost of transportation, where transportation is more congested, slower maybe, and takes longer in bigger places. So, and at some level, our urban models are telling us that transportation must be at the root of the problem. The reason why housing is so expensive in some parts is because living much further away is really costly. So you want to be where the action is. You want to be in places where access is good and easy. So the World Bank was interested in doing that for trying to know more about India. So there's no data. There's no official data. There's no travel surveys. There's no nothing. So my idea was to say, okay, let's ask Google Maps. You know, Google Maps, well, today is giving us real-time, well-travel time for many, many places in the world, including most of India. When you start like this, it's only the very beginning of the job because, you know, we can do that. So it was not available, 10 years ago. It's becoming available today. Great. But this is only the beginning of the investigation of the research question. You know, first, we need to set up some logistics. Okay, I've been to Mumbai, and I remember going to from this hotel to that place, and so you ask with Google Maps, and 10 minutes later, you have like one observation. In order to examine the whole country and maybe whatever 150 cities, what you need to set up a big piece of infrastructure that's going to ask with Google Maps, lots and lots of queries about some origins and some destinations that you may want to consider, and do that throughout the day. And you know, when you do that in your office in Philadelphia, it's going to be typically 3 a.m. in Mumbai, so it's not very good. Well, you want to do that actually when people want to travel in Mumbai. So you want to set up some logistics to organize those queries. Then, you know, it's about trips that you're making up. So my quip was usually when I present the paper is to say, oh, this is something that is going to be exogenous. That's the good news. Well, the bad news, it's all made up. You know, these are trips that are all made up, that are coming. So you need to think about some design strategies for this travel information that you're going to generate that makes sense. And part of the issue here is you want to actually maybe have different design strategies for trips and try to see whether or not those design strategies are all giving us the same answer. Then there are also some conceptual issues. You know, what does it mean to how do we measure actually mobility? What is really trip time? How should we be thinking about mobility, congestion, how far will you have to go to find stuff in those places, and so on and so forth. So you need to think also a little bit about theory and come up with something that actually makes sense from a theoretical point of view. You also need to think about data quality, how do I know that I'm not going to retrieve some Google algorithm in order to generate travel time for India? So in that case, when you need to start thinking about confronting that data with some alternative sources of data, be they coming from Uber movements, trying to see actually if we see some minute differences on particular days where we expect to see them because there was a strike, because there was this, because there was that. Then you have a whole bunch of data. So we started asking about 30 million trips. How do you aggregate that? How do you think meaningfully? We have 30 million trips. We want to retrieve some information about 150 cities. What sort of indices? How do we want to think about actually mobility within cities versus across cities? So there's a whole range of things that you need to solve when you're doing that sort of project. It's really exciting. It's really new and a new source of data. But at the same time, since people have not been there before, we need to reinvent a lot of hardware in order to proceed. So what do we find about travel in India, which I think it's really interesting. First, it's really heterogeneous. The slowest places in India are only half or twice as slow as the fastest places. In the US, between the worst part of the US, which may be not very far from here, for traffic, which is within the loop, in Chicago, and the better parts, some other cities in the Midwest, like Milwaukee, it's going to be maybe 30 to 40%. India is 1 to 2. What is also interesting is that the fastest place in India at the fastest time is still slower than the slowest place in this country at the slowest time, which is the central part of Chicago at 8 a.m., essentially. So India is really, really slow. So this I was expecting. What came more as a surprise is it tends to be slow all the time. At night, during the day, at peak hour, at supposedly peak hours, not at sub-peak hours, things are slow absolutely all the time. We actually see this thing that we call congestion, where speeds go down dramatically only in the very center of maybe 10 cities at most, and no more than that. So we think it's an interesting finding because these are the places we tend to go to when we go to India, and we see, oh, it's horrible, there's a lot of congestion, but it's, these are really important parts of India, but at the same time, these are only 5 to 10 centers, no more. What was also interesting to find was we do see that actually, mobility is very, very bad in really, really poor places. And as places get richer, mobility is improving because basically their infrastructure seems to be improving. And then it's going down again because people buy more cars and more vehicles. And then we do see some congestion indeed. Finally, one last pretty tentative but interesting finding is that there's no correlation between mobility by car and mobility by transit. Because mobility by transit, to the extent that we can capture transit in India, which is going to be mostly official transit, we have no idea about informal transit, but mobility by transit is going to be driven mostly by how far you are from transit and how long will you have to wait for transit to show up.
Great. Cities are the absence of physical space between people and firms. Cities are density, proximity, closeness. They exist because there is demand for proximity to other people, and they are absolute hives of externalities, positive and negative, which is in fact one way of just saying what Gilles just told you. In some sense, when you study cities, you want to think about a triad, right? The top one, which is symbolized here by the old market of Jerusalem, is the positive stuff that goes on in cities, the positive agglomeration economies, the spillovers that exist. There are also these downsides, the negative externalities of proximity, the demons that come with density, which include contagious disease, traffic congestion, and crime. And then, of course, there's this third aspect of the city, which is the physical structures of the city, which are always shaping things. They're never the real city, all right? That's part of the contributions that social scientists have made to architects, is to try and convince them that it's not the skyscrapers that matter, it's the people that live in those skyscrapers. In the US, I typically did work for the first 20 years of my life on the positive stuff in cities. In the developing world, which I've spent much of my last 5 years, as Gilles has told you, I've focused much more on bad stuff that happens in cities. And what I'm going to give you now is a very quick tour of things that I've been thinking about over the last 36 months. So the first externality, the one that comes even before you worry about traffic congestion, is contagious disease, is waterborne disease, right? And in fact, America's cities and towns, the cities of the West, suffered from an enormous mortality gap until the start of the 20th century, precisely because of contagious diseases. Life expectancy was about 7 years lower in New York City for a boy born there in 1900 than there was else in the US. This is still a battle that's going on in the developing world. And one paper that I've written uses the exogenous or quasi-exogenous variation that comes from random outages of the water supply network to look at the impact of that on health, on wealth, and on young women who are not able to do their schoolwork because they're doing chores for the household. The interesting fact, and this is Lusaka, this just shows you how many days per week people typically lack water. So this is showing you lots of areas where they're lacking water 3 days a week, which should remind you that in fact it's never just about building the infrastructure, it's also about the institutions and incentives that go with the infrastructure as well. One point that I like to make, and this is a completely unidentified fact, but it's my favorite fact that came out of that paper, is the correlation between the amount of days that you spend without water and whether or not you pay the water company by the month or by the liter. And the answer is you are vastly more likely to get your water pipes fixed if you pay by the liter than if you pay by the month. Because, of course, the water company has an incentive to fix the pipes if you're paying by the liter. So this is another paper in Lusaka, and both of these papers are joint with Nava Ashraf. Much of urbanization, right, increases the need for and the difficulty of achieving trust. So part of the whole point of cities is you deal with strangers. And when you think about sub-Saharan Africa today, you have a vast influx of people who work together with their relatives, with people they've known for generations in traditional rural villages, and now they're actually trying to cooperate in a weak rule of law environment with people who are absolute strangers. These benefits are particularly hard to enjoy if, in fact, you are among the more vulnerable. So what we've been working on is the challenges for female entrepreneurs in Lusaka. And I'm just going to say a couple of things about this. But basically, from our ethnographic work, we're fairly convinced that the threat of violence lies constantly in male-female bargaining in these situations, as it does throughout most of history. This helps explain why women select into industries that are predominantly female. So, 75% of women in Zambia are in apparel making, which is an industry that's 50-50 male-female, and enables them to work with other women rather than actually interact with men who tend to make things harder for them. And they're very rarely in other industries which are overwhelmingly men. Essentially, the entire gap between male and female earnings in these sectors is explained by the industrial concentration of women into food and apparel. One of the points, it's a point that I really learned from Bob Lucas 30-odd years ago here, was one of the greatest things that cities do is enable people to learn from one another. You all should know that proximity speeds the flow of ideas because you're at the University of Chicago, for goodness sakes. And I can't think of any place where I have ever experienced ideas moving more rapidly over close distances than here at the U of C. But when there is an inability to trust people, the ability to share ideas goes down. And what you're seeing here is the difference. We asked people in our survey, who did you learn your trade from? Women are much less likely to say they learn their trade from other entrepreneurs or from family members, and much more likely to say that they go to formal schooling. And here you show, depending upon where so the blue bars are people who started the business from scratch, the green bars are people who said they bought it, the red lines are people who inherited it. The red lines, because people are learning from their family, women are learning from family members if they inherited it, are about equal. All the other ones, it's about twice as high, the male propensity to learn from the people around them in cities relative to going to formal schooling. Right? That shows partially this ability to trust people is related to your ability to protect your own interests. Rule of law is delivered in Zambia through these formal markets. And the point of, in some sense, the point of the paper is that rule of law is particularly good for women. And we were able to show this in two ways, one of which is just our cross-sectional data, where we show a bunch of different forms of cooperative behavior. We show that they're significantly lower for women, and we show that for those women who are in markets, that gap essentially disappears. Because what the market has is it has a market chief who functions by providing contract disputes. He functions by solving contract disputes by acting like a deliverer of law. Nothing is exogenous here, so to supplement this, we did a lab in the field game where we actually asked people to trust, and then we randomized who had access to a market chief to adjudicate disputes, and we saw exactly the same thing. The presence of the market chief enabled women to trust because they knew the market chief was going to defend them. And that's what this shows. Gilles talked a bit about it, right? And Gilles has been a true leader in this. But we are at a golden age of doing urban research using new types of tools and using new types of technology. And Gilles was talking about the Google data, which is great. Together with Mike Luca, we've been using, you actually only get demographic neighborhood data in the US about 5 years out of date. And 5 years for a politician is like an infinite number of years for a normal person. It turns out you can use things like Yelp data in order to measure neighborhood change more quickly and look at things that are changing. So I'm just showing you the correlation between, let's say, the demographics of the area, which are, you know, how we're thinking about gentrification, and various types of Yelp things. So there's a strong correlation between educational upgrading and the number of groceries and the number of cafes. My favorite fact, this is a New York paper, is the strong correlation between the number of laundromats on Yelp and gentrification. And of course, the natural explanation for that is it's not a particularly yuppie thing to go to a laundromat. But after you've gone to the laundromat to think, boy, I really have to write about this online, you really need too much education to think that's a remotely sensible thing to do. We've been for many years working on using street-level imagery and computer vision techniques to measure urban change. This is joint with Nikhil Naik, who's the computer scientist who's really responsible for this. Some early papers used Google Images in 2007 and 2014 and used a tool called Street View in order to measure urban change. This starts with crowdsourced data about how whether or not people think neighborhoods look nice or not, and then we use computer vision to mimic what the human eye does. We're able to show that just as cities that are dense and cities that are better educated have done well, within cities, the neighborhoods that experience the most upgrading are those that are denser and better educated. We also mimic things that were found in the Chicago School of Sociology almost 100 years ago, which is this sort of invasion or creep nature of gentrification. Places that are close to rich areas, close to nicer areas, close to downtown, those are the ones that have seen the fastest upgrading in terms of these things. You can also predict income from the images. It turns out you can do that astonishingly well across neighborhoods in the US. You get R-squareds of like 81% out of sample in New York, 86% for Boston. But we weren't able to do this very well in the developing world, where it would be most exciting to be able to predict income based on the images. And part of it is just if you're poor, you tend not to spend on things which would advertise, come rob me. Okay, you can also use this to duplicate what appraisers do when they go out so you can predict prices. Turns out you actually can't predict prices all that much better with the images than you can with just a standard housing price regression, but you can actually do better than any of the in-person appraisers, at least used by the city of Boston. You can also test other questions, right? One of which is how important is the image of a house for its price, and the answer is not a huge amount relative to like the number of bathrooms, which is a hugely important variable. The second question is, does neighborhood appearance drive price? And it does certainly significantly. The R-squared added isn't huge. And third, do changes in incentives influence investment that impact appearance? So you can use this image not as an explanatory variable, but as a measure of how well the house is being taken care of. So you can test whether or not homes get upgraded right before they sell, or do homes that go through foreclosure see a decline in their value. And I'll just end with that. When we do that, we find by looking at the images, houses 2007, 2014, comparing houses that go through foreclosure with a propensity scored matched set of 5 nearest neighbors in that, and we find about a 3% loss in value for those houses that go through foreclosure, which is a lot lower than the estimates find when they actually compare the prices of foreclosed houses versus not, which either means that those foreclosed houses are depreciating on the inside, which we can't see, or it means those studies are flawed because they're actually just measuring the fire sale aspect of it. And last thing I want to talk about, and this is from a paper with Larry Summers and Ben Austin from last year. Last point I want to make. I happen to think America's largest unsolved social problem is the vast increase in the number of jobless prime-aged men. That's men from 25 to 54, which is a definition I find increasingly offensive. And the tremendous geographic variety in that. So, when I was born, 1 in 20 prime-aged men were jobless. Now, for most of the past decade, 3 in 20 have been over 15%. That is highly geographically concentrated. These pockets of joblessness are not going away. There's incredible persistence of them. Being jobless in terms of all of the things we know in terms of happiness or other social problems appears to be a lot worse than just having a low income and being poor. That's caused me to rethink some of my long-held views about spatial policies, and it doesn't lead me to think that we should bribe people to move into these areas, but it does make me think that we perhaps need different government policies for different places. So a policy that is sensible for a labor market like Seattle's is unlikely to be sensible for a labor market like West Virginia's. So let me stop there.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for having me in this panel. So I'm going to take the opportunity or the 5 minutes that I get at the beginning to talk about some research that I've been doing with people at the Richmond Fed, Pierre Sartre and Felipe Schwartzman, and essentially take over from where Ed ended, namely think about spatial inequality, and in particular I want to think about occupational inequality, or occupational segregation. The fact that when you look at cities in the US, but also in general mega cities in the world, they are not just concentration of a lot of people in a particular place, but they are also concentrations of income, concentration of skills, concentration of particular occupations. And I want to think in particular about occupations now, and to do so, I want to divide occupations into two groups. One group I'm going to call cognitive non-routine occupations, things that where you need your head, you need to think, and are things that are not just repetition of something, but the problems change. And so these are your consultants, doctors, engineers, lawyers, managers, programmers, researchers, etc. And that's it. And when you look at the data, these occupations are extremely concentrated in space. And this concentration in space, of course, implies, because these people earn more and are more skilled, they imply concentration of income and skills, okay? So here's a map of the US, and the lighter colors imply that the share of CNRs, these cognitive non-routine occupations, is larger, and you can see that, it's mostly in the big cities. So the big cities are the ones where you see this concentration. And there's another fact that you don't see in this map, but it's the case, that is, it has been growing, this concentration, this occupational concentration has been growing a lot over the last 3-4 decades. And so that leads to the question of whether there's a policy problem here, whether there's something that we need to address. Is there too much concentration of these skills or these occupations that is leading to spatial inequalities in income, etc., that we may not like? And this is expressed in the press or maybe in your other classes, etc., as sometimes a gentrification crisis or an affordability crisis, because CNRs are grouping in these cities and they earn more, they're spending more, they're pricing others out, right? And so that's pushing some of the other occupations out of these cities, right? And so some people may think that there's a problem there, or it's something that we want to find out. And so now the first thing that you need to think about when you address this problem, the first main issue is that CNR workers are extremely scarce in our economy. They are very valuable. They are hard. In order to become a CNR worker, you need skills and you need a lot of years of education. So producing a CNR worker is expensive for society. And so if we're going to design policies, if we want to try to think about whether this is good to concentrate on them or not, one thing that we need to keep in mind is that we better allocate them well in the economy, because it's a scarce resource that is very expensive to replicate. Okay, so here and so if we think about, well, how should we allocate these particular occupations, these valuable workers? Here's a fact that I find useful to think about it. And so what you have here is the relative wage of CNR workers, right? And I order that on the x-axis as a function of the CNR share, so the share of those occupations in total city employment. And you see a very kind of strong positive correlation between the relative wage, right, and the abundance, if you will, of this CNR. Now, this is not what you would expect in a regular market, right? Normally, abundance leads to lower prices, not higher prices, right? And this is, by the way, robust to industrial composition and so on. So what's going on? So one interpretation of this, and we've done a lot of more work to kind of verify this in different ways, is that there's occupation-specific externalities. It's kind of what Ed was saying to some extent, which is you put a lot of these people in the same room, they benefit from each other, and it's important that it's only them, that it's among them, among people that are doing this type of occupations. And so you can verify that in fact the productivity of CNR workers seems to be increasing in the share of CNR workers. And if that's the case, of course, then the optimal allocation is going to tell you, well, you want to group them together, right? So you want to group them together, and so essentially what you want to do is you want to create these cognitive hubs, right? These cities are cognitive hubs where you're going to bring these occupations together, and you want to segregate. Segregation in that sense, occupational segregation of that type, seems efficient. And so what does if you put it all together in a quantitative spatial model, what would this tell you? It tells you, well, you want to subsidize people that are not in those occupations to move out and go to some other cities where they concentrate and do these other occupations. Not all of them, because of course there's complementarities in production, but some of them, so as to alleviate the congestion of having, very big cities. So here is an example of, if you put it all together, where you would like to have these cognitive hubs. And of course, the usual suspects, light up. The lighter the color, the bigger is the social value of adding an extra CNR worker relative to the private value as implied by such a model. And so you see that all the places that are yellow or green are places where you want to create essentially these hubs, and all the places that are blue are places where you want to grow them by having more non-CNR occupations rather than CNR occupations. The light colors are these cognitive hubs. Okay, so what did I tell you? Everything is dandy there. Then, we're having increasing concentration, and that seems efficient because we have these externalities among CNRs. So what's the problem? Well, there is a problem, and the problem is that in some sense the economy is achieving that concentration of CNRs in ways that are not ideal. How is the economy achieving this? It's achieving this with housing supply restrictions, with bad infrastructure for commuting, something that both Ed and Gilles were talking about. That is increasing the prices in these cities, pricing some of those non-CNR workers out, but then all the benefits go to the landowners in those cities rather than transferring income to the non-CNR workers to allow for those cognitive hubs that are going to make the economy more efficient. There's better ways that are Pareto efficient in the sense that allow everyone to benefit from this process of occupational segregation. So in that sense, we can have these cities, we can have these cognitive hubs, but we want to do it with policies that transfer part of those gains to the non-CNR workers that are going to some of the smaller towns. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those wonderful presentations. Just to kind of kickstart the discussion and kind of get the discussion rolling, I want to ask a general question about the role of economics in understanding the issues of urbanization with particular attention to megacities. The UN defines megacities as having more than 10 million inhabitants. As of right now, Tokyo, New York City, Paris, Berlin, Beijing, and Bangkok are all cities that are classified as megacities. What is particularly special or interesting about this classification, and how does this appear in the research questions that you ask?
Okay, let me start. You probably know about this famous discussion between Hemingway and Scott Fitzgerald, where Fitzgerald, the author of The Great Gatsby, was telling Hemingway, rich people, they're very different from us. And Hemingway sternly responded, yes, they have more money. So what does it have to do with cities and mega cities? The question is whether small cities are just miniature replicas of large cities, i.e. they're just large cities, or very large cities are just small cities with more people, or whether they're actually different sort of animals, a different sort of beast. And I think there are two aspects to that question. The first one is about land use. So do large cities have land organized differently relative to small cities? And yes, it looks like there's something going on where small cities they typically have a single center, whereas large cities, they tend to be more multicentric. Esteban has worked on those issues. So there's something about land use, yes, in terms of urban structure, large cities will tend to be different. And they also tend to be different in terms of structure of production. When we look at large cities, at least in rich countries, they seem to be doing management, research, innovation. I mean, I think this is a slightly different take relative to what Esteban just said, but we're getting at the same idea. Well, smaller cities, they seem to be more about producing stuff, like production activities. So they tend to be different. And one of the things actually about megacities in developing countries which makes them perhaps problematic is we're not seeing this distinction. In developing countries, megacities, they seem to be doing more of the management, the little bit of innovation, but also a lot more of the production. They seem to be still very manufacturing well-oriented, way more than the rest of their country. And maybe that's a problem for those places because there's all those secondary cities which seem to be only slowly developing and very dormant and facing lots of issues in terms of economic dynamism. So yes, large cities seem to be different in all sorts of ways, and when they're not, it may also be a problem.
Okay, I'll make 3 points. One of which, because I agree with everything Gilles said, of course.
You always do.
I always,
at least in public.
I always do. No, I do probably. The only thing I really disagree with is the UBI point. I think your basic analysis is right, but we're going to have a fight about UBI afterwards. Okay. So 3 points. One of which is the way an urban system looks in a country has a lot to do with when it was developed. Okay. And one of the things that's sort of striking about Europe is the extent to which there really aren't, with the possible exception of Paris and London, there really aren't anything that looks like megacities in Europe. There are connected city systems. And a lot of that reflects the fact that European cities grew during a very high transport cost era, during a time in which these ideas, which were put together by the original regional scientists of Losch and Kristallar 100 years ago, you had these little towns through everywhere because the transportation costs were really small, really high. And then the urbanization that happened afterwards didn't have to have small towns thrown throughout the German countryside. It made sense to have just a lot of people in LA, right? And it made sense to have a lot of people in Chicago, whereas even the eastern seaboard of the US just has a lot more small towns because it was developed during an earlier time in terms of the transportation costs. So one part of the sort of megacities is completely natural, completely normal, and it reflects the fact that you just don't need to spread out your urban areas more. Second point that I want to make is that there also is an aspect of this which is deeply non-normal, which is the fact that most of the the developing world's megacities, right, are political to at least a very significant degree. They're cities that have not, as Gilles said, have not risen because of an obvious manufacturing edge. They're anchored by the capital. And 25 years ago, I wrote a paper called Trade and Circuses Explaining Urban Giants that made the empirical point that if you looked at the capital cities of the primate cities of dictatorships or unstable democracies, they were 50% larger than the capital cities of democratic areas, because we put our rules around our capital cities to stop them from seizing all the rents, whereas in the developing world, all the rents flow to the capital city, and people follow power like ants go to a picnic. Third point I want to make about this, which is related to what people are doing in these areas and how we think about their change. I think that there is the most worrisome thing to me, and it relates to both talks, is there is a model for moving from poverty into wealth that has been followed by the West starting 250 years ago, has been followed by East Asia 60 years ago, which is moving into exported manufacturing goods. I wonder almost every day whether or not that path will be open for the megacities of sub-Saharan Africa, the megacities of South Asia, in part because of increased capital deepening in manufacturing in East Asia and the US, which is just going to make it increasingly difficult for a labor-intensive form of manufacturing to possibly compete. And when I think about the sort of megacities and what's happening in them, a lot seems to hinge upon whether or not that path will be open to them or not.
I agree with everything, but I just want to emphasize this idea of the structural transformation and the extent to which the structural transformation happens through cities, and particularly in the largest cities. It's in these cities where we see the industries that are booming in a particular point in time are always in these cities. And so we saw it with manufacturing, and we then see it with services. And now we're seeing with ICT and the big centers of where the fixed cost of all the distribution systems, etc., it's in these big cities. That's where the innovation is happening. And so starting mega cities is starting that innovation. So I think in terms of the question that Gilles was asking, do these large cities, mega cities, do they look different than the smaller cities? Are these just like, replicas, larger replicas of the same type of city? And the answer is clearly not. Clearly not. The occupational structure is very different. And what's happening in the cities, the type of innovation that is happening in the mega cities, is also very different. So I think, studying them is exactly studying the process of innovation and how that process of innovation happens in the world and leads to a structural transformation. So I think that's the part that is very meaningful of studying particularly the very large cities.
Thank you. One last question before we kickstart the discussion on your research. We have two alumni with us, Professor Glaeser and Professor Rossi-Hansberg. How did your time at the University of Chicago shape your research and also just your approach to economics with issues of urbanization?
You go first, Esteban.
Okay.
Your memories are more recent, and you have more hair.
I came to the University of Chicago to do my PhD. I wanted to do finance. I never opened an urban economics book, never took an urban economics class before coming to the University of Chicago. Then I wanted to do finance. Then I got bored with finance, wanted to do macro, started working with Bob Lucas, and it just happened to be the case that Bob Lucas was working on a paper called Externalities and Cities, and I became his array for that paper. And that's the first time I saw a model of cities. I started thinking about cities, and I got hooked. And here I am, many years later. So, the University of Chicago obviously has a great tradition, has a very great tradition of thinkers that have been very broad. And because they've been very broad, if you're broad, you have to touch upon cities eventually, right? It's just such a central topic. And so Bob Lucas and Sherwin Rosen and Gary Becker, they all did.
It's true. It's true. So my path was similar, and Bob was pretty central. So the way that cities got involved in my life, in my research, was that in the late 1980s, in the mid-1980s, when Chicago professors like Paul Romer and Bob Lucas were revolutionizing growth theory, that led them to an idea that growth itself came from the spread of ideas across people in ways that were not fully internalized. So there were positive externalities associated with disembodied knowledge in Romer's work, in human capital, and Lucas's work. Now this led in Lucas's very famous paper on the mechanics of economic development, published in the Journal of Monetary Economics in 1988, to a last section where he sort of rediscovered Jane Jacobs and her work on ideas spreading across cities, and stuck in this sort of stuff at the end about, these human capital spillovers sound a lot like what Jane was talking about in cities. And, he talked about this, and it got, as it got in the air, right? Which is, in fact, the amazing thing is this whole thing is so meta, because it's exactly like what he was writing about then became in the air of the time. And we started working on testing these ideas. Now, when it came, just to give a little bit of a slight difference in terms of what Esteban and I do and what traditions we come out of, although Lucas is central to both of our journeys on this, Esteban comes cleanly out of the sort of Chicago macro tradition, whereas I really do not. I'm a student of, above all, I guess, Gary Becker, who is in some senses the central intellectual presence in my life, but also Sherwin, who was a great urban economist, although he rarely thought of himself of it, but the intercity model for thinking about an absence of spatial arbitrage, helping us to understand differences, wages, and prices across space, that's Sherwin, and then his student Jennifer Roback. This place was just magical for thinking about these things then.
So a significant subfield within urban economics involves creating models to understand how cities evolve and develop into particular organizational patterns that we observe. When building your models, how do you balance the opposing goals of creating simple, elegant models with the regional peculiarities of cities?
Maybe Esteban should start on that one.
Yeah.
So I've been a big proponent of quantitative spatial theories, which are, taking these models and trying to, inform them with data in a way that they speak, at a granular level about, what is happening, and can replicate at the granular level, the data, and then can be used to do contrafactual exercises. So I think that if we want to think seriously about economics helping us in policy making, in detailed policy making, we need these models to do the counterfactuals, to put in the policies and see what happens so that we can take into account the general equilibrium effects and all sorts of other interactions that are going to be affected by these policies. I think economics has a lot to add, and I think these models have come a long way, so they're very useful. Now, of course, when you're thinking about a new mechanism, a novel mechanism, that's not the way you test it. The way you test it, the way you think about it, is with a much more conceptual model, an analytical tool to think about your mechanism. And so it's about the level of abstractions of the ideas and where these ideas are in terms of their development. At the beginning, you start with models that are much more analytical. Once they mature, you can put them in a way that are useful in a quantitative way to give numbers, to give actual implications and evaluations of policy.
Yeah, I mean, I write what Esteban calls conceptual models, right? I don't do very much beyond that. There are reasons in which case they all tend to be very highly stylized. Although there are still cases in which I feel like these relatively simple models can give answers that are useful for policymakers. So just to give a clear example for this, and partially it's useful because very rarely, at least in my experience, do I have a chance to actually design exactly the policy that I would like. So let me give a clear example, which is, do we do too much to restrict the construction of new housing? That came up in Esteban's thing in the end. I believe this very strongly. I've been arguing in some sense for this for the last 18 years of my life, 17 years of my life. Why do I believe this? Well, in simple attempts to quantify the externalities of new building, my attempts to do that have found that they seem to be vastly smaller, whatever negative externalities are created, relative to the benefits of allowing an extra house, which is basically the value the consumer puts on it minus the cost of delivering the house. So I find that to be quite large in our empirical work relative to the externalities. Now that would not tell me, and just to highlight the point, that would not tell me where the optimal policy should be in various places. You would need an actual quantitative model if you're going to get that. Now, when I actually deal with policymakers, we are so far away from being able to actually choose what goes where, and most of the time, because we're constrained by the politics. So most of the time I'm in this sort of thing that Marty Feldstein talked about in the 1970s. You don't necessarily need to know where you end up. You just need to know what direction you want to push. And I kind of know I want to push for more housing. And I don't know, most of the time I'm so far away from where I want to end up that I don't need to know that.
I've been doing work at really both ends of the spectrum, and hopefully a lot of it in between, ranging from pieces that were mostly urban theory to pieces like what I described about rail transportation in India, which were very, very descriptive. But at the same time, even when I do very, very descriptive work, I always have this vision of what are the guiding principles, what is the underlying model. So it's not going to be a super sophisticated model, it's going to be some sort of monocentric model. But I'm trying to understand about what's going on with those commuting cost parameters, how, trying to measure that for a whole city, part of a city, then trying to correlate that with stuff. So it's very, very descriptive, but at the same time, there's always a theoretical framework that is really, really strong behind even the most descriptive work. Or sometimes I'm trying to estimate some elasticity of something, some elasticity of agglomeration with respect to city population. We don't do that because we are just obsessed with that, because this is a really important quantity in most models, because this quantity then is going to determine the size of cities, how efficient, allow us to think about any inefficiencies and so on and so forth. So even when I do something that is very empirical and sometimes very partial, I always try to have that or to have at the back of my mind the fact that those quantities that I'm trying to estimate are part of a much bigger object that are going to be used after by others or by myself in different works, trying to participate into some construction of knowledge.
Just cities are too complicated to do empirical work without theory. I think that's one way. It's sort of impossible to make sense of cities without some theory.
Thank you. The megacities literature doesn't seem to engage very much in the difference between centrally planned and unplanned cities. Professor Rossi-Hansberg, in your 2013 paper, Urban Accounting and Welfare, you and your co-authors compare cities within the US and those within China, and find that there are tremendous welfare gains in China by introducing policies that reduce regional differences in 3 key factors: amenities, efficiency, and congestion. What role do you think central planning plays in the validity of comparing the US and China with regards to your defined factors of interest?
I think it's crucial. I mean, but I mean, I would have a little bit of an argument, or I'm going to push back a little bit on the premise of the question, which is that, you know, urban economics has not engaged in, you know, central planning, or it has not thought about, you know, central planning in the context of cities. In fact, pretty much all the theory of systems of cities has to deal with the issue of local developers or urban developers, because otherwise you have like an essential indeterminacy of what cities enter and how, you know, to what extent new cities form, etc. So most of those models actually have some sort of urban planner behind them doing and managing things, even, you know, perhaps beyond what we actually see in reality, right? So now, having said that, in that paper in particular, I do think that a big difference between China and the US comes from the fact that China has restricted migration across cities. And the fact that China has restricted migration across cities means that individuals are not necessarily optimizing themselves, and therefore, when you do an intervention, you know, in some sense, the envelope theorem doesn't apply. You are not, and so that means that, you know, the welfare gains tend to be larger because of that. Another issue is that if you think about the bigger cities like Beijing and Shanghai, where the hukou system really is binding, when you do this type of exercise where you're trying to recover the characteristics of cities, like in that paper in particular, the productivity, amenities, and frictions in the cities, or that are implied through the provision of urban infrastructure, what you find is that essentially you're misinterpreting the amenities of these cities, because they are too small relative to, you know, their characteristics, because the government is preventing migration to them. And so the model essentially reads them as being not that nice, not a nice place to live. Why? Because we see too few people there, right? But it's because of the restriction, not because they're actually not that nice, or perhaps it's not because of that. And so, you know, when you relax or when you equalize amenities, those cities tend to grow a lot, right? And there's a lot of gains because they're much more productive than other cities.
So let me try to get at this question, but very differently, because I agree with everything Esteban has said. And so the record for pure laissez-faire is not very good because there's no real market, there's no well-functioning market for cities. Okay, there's a guy that created Irvine, California, and he's whatever, the 7th richest man in America, I think. He's the richest urban developer, he's the richest real estate developer, well, for sure. But it's hard, you know, it's hard because there's a big lumpy thing that you need to do, and unless you have very, very deep pockets. So laissez-faire is not going to work very well, but at the same time, the record of central planning is pretty horrible. I'll try to mitigate with that statement at the end, but you know, like, everywhere in the world, we see human densities that are falling as you move away from the center, and there are lots of really good reasons for that. The two exceptions are Russia, because that was done by the Soviet planners, where the gradient is inversed, reversed, and South Africa, because that's a legacy of apartheid, where a very unpleasant white-dominated power was trying to push the black population as far as possible, well, from the center. But these are the two exceptions that confirm well the rule. Then there's also bad record with the central planning. All those capital cities that were created ex nihilo in the middle of nowhere, ranging from just reasonably bad cases like Brasilia in Brazil, which is not very efficient, to situations that are pretty horrible, like the capital city of Ivory Coast is not in Abidjan. It was relocated to Yamoussoukro, which is a village in the middle of nowhere, but was the village where the former world president was born. And unfortunately, this is not the only case. I mean, there's actually a recent article in The Economist, it's either this week or last week, where there's like 10 or 15 examples, and none of them is good. The one thing that mitigates that is when you look at urban India, there's actually one city that is less dysfunctional than the others. It's Chandigarh, where actually traffic flows more reasonably, and people seem to be living in better housing and the better living conditions. And that's the city that was planned by a Frenchman, Le Corbusier. At the same time, I think Le Corbusier did a huge amount of harm by planning all those suburbs with high rises and stuff that are deeply, deeply dysfunctional. But Chandigarh maybe was the exception to the bad record of central planning.
So I want to, I take as given I agree with everything that was just said. The first, I guess I want to make 2 points here. One of which is, when I was a graduate student here, I had the, political views to match almost entirely. And I'm not sure that how far my broad political views have changed from that. But there's an old saying that there's no such thing as as an atheist in a foxhole. It's also true there's no such thing as a sensible libertarian in a city. That cities are full of all sorts of crazy externalities that require some form of management. And there is a model which says, look, if we really thought we could have all cities being privately provided, right, that would work. But then in those cases, let me tell you, when you do see cities that are privately provided, they're engaging in massive amounts of regulation and social engineering in their privately provided cities, right? So that when you see these things happen, they're hardly then look like models of complete freedom. Places like the Woodlands, for example, in Texas, or Irvine. That being said, right, and the reason for this is there are these, awful externalities that can exist. There's traffic congestion, which is, a classic Pigouvian externality of my driving slows someone else down, right? We economists have had an answer for this, which is some form of congestion pricing for 60 years. It may be, some of Gabriel Kreindler's work suggests that it may not be as effective as we'd hoped that it would be, but it's, we have interventions, contagious disease as well, massive externalities associated with, the spread of things like cholera, wiping out vast numbers of people. This requires some form of management, okay? And typically, as economists, we lean towards management which involves some form of pricing rather than command and control rules, but some form of management. Now, the thing is that often the field of urban planning and the field of architecture thinks that the right solution for all of these things is going to be a physical one, involves something that you can do physically that will solve everything, which is very rarely the right answer. There are better and worse ways to get things done physically, but in fact, physical planning is not going to solve all of traffic congestion in most of the world. It's not going to solve contagious disease in sub-Saharan Africa. And there needs to be other things which, again, always involve some combination of infrastructure and incentives. And I want to just give one last example of the infrastructure and incentives point, right? So in much of sub-Saharan Africa, people build water mains. Nice, meaning NGOs build water mains, the Millennium Account builds water mains. And then they say, we expect poor people to connect to these water mains. Right? And it costs like $1,000 to do the connection, and so poor people don't connect, and they continue to use the shallow boreholes and the wells, and they continue to die. This shouldn't have been a surprise to anyone. In 1842, New York built the Croton Aqueduct, and for the next 25 years, New York continued to have cholera epidemics because New York did not impose Pigouvian taxes on people who didn't connect to the water supply, and so the poor people continue to use shallow wells, and they continue to die. It's only after 1867 when the Metropolitan Board of Health starts imposing costs on people who don't connect, starts finding the landlords who actually don't do this, that you actually see mortality rates start declining. And so the point is, it's never just about, right, incentives. It's about the institutions that go with the incentives and the infrastructure as well. And sometimes the physical planning can help, but sometimes you actually, really need to engage in this using the classic tools of economics.
Well, thank you. It seems that all of you have already touched a little bit on the role of urban economics and urban planning and policymaking. So urban economics does have enormous implications for policymakers at all levels of government. And how has the potential impact on policymaking affected your research? And do you engage in activities outside of academic publishing to push some of the learnings from the academic sphere into the public one?
Okay, so I think there's one of the reasons why Ed and me have started to work in developing countries is that trying to influence urban policies in Europe, for me, in this country, here is really, really hard. Whereas actually when you go to many countries, people will be open. Sometimes they will end up doing the wrong things. I was working with the World Bank in Argentina with the all new world government, trying to re-engage with each other and stuff. And they were listening. Initially, they started with this idea that they wanted to build one big highway going from Buenos Aires towards the poor north of Argentina. And when we started telling them about gravity relationships and the fact that the trade flows would not probably increase all that much, they started thinking about some other ideas. At the same time, when you engage in the policy world, you need to accept that you're going to lose pretty often. In Argentina, they started having problems paying their civil servants at the end of the month and paying for their debt. And suddenly it was all about balancing the books and all those plans about building infrastructure, regional policy, that suddenly that all disappeared. I haven't been to Argentina in the last 18 months, whereas I was going like every 2 or 3 months before that. But from time to time, you will score the odd victory, and you feel that odd victory is actually pretty important. The first time I did policy, I was brought in with Tony Venables, with the British Treasury, trying to go against some reasonably crazy initiatives to build the new Silicon Valley well everywhere in the UK. We thought it was a bad idea. We made the case. Eventually, that was defeated. You know, I did some back of the envelope calculation about the welfare losses that we avoided by doing that. Even if I think I was maybe no more than 0.5% of that decision, it's still a pretty large amount of money. So I was feeling quite good about myself on that one. Then I fought the same fight in France, and I just lost it. You know, these things happen. Two more things about the policy world. For me, it's always been a source of inspiration. Not that I want to do the research that the policymakers may want me to do, because sometimes it's stuff that is very mundane, that is not very interesting. But listening to their preoccupations, what they have to say, I think is a very useful input in my thinking. And the other thing is, but yes, at the same time, it's pretty hard to keep a balance between the policy making and being in the real world and being in academia. It's because as soon as you start being in policy making, they always ask for more. So yesterday, actually, I was on the phone with the chief of road of the city of Chicago. And at some point he said, oh, and we're going to rethink all the taxation we do for transportation, blah, blah, blah. Would you be interested in participating? I said, yeah, I'd like to know a little bit more and come to meetings and see what people have to say. He said, yeah, but we'd like to do people doing background reports and groundwork and stuff. And I'm like, no, sorry, I can't do that, because if I start doing that, I'm not going to do any research anymore. So it's difficult to keep a reasonable balance in that world.
Yeah. I'm just going to tell one story, which is I cannot tell you how many times I end up in a policymaker's, like in a presidential chief of staff's office, and in like the developing world, and the question that they have for you is, great, you're an expert on cities. Tell me how I stop all these poor people from coming to my city and screwing it up. That's the overwhelming question, I think, that I've gotten asked here. And then you try very hard to sort of make the case that that's not the right answer, that you're aware of all of these bad things that happen in cities, but you know of no pathway into being a wealthy country that doesn't run through city streets. And that in fact urbanization is almost, it's not causal in the sense, but it's not clear that we know any other way of developing that doesn't involve urbanization. And that almost surely the right answer is to try and make the downsides of urbanization less painful, rather than to stop urbanization entirely. And I guess the thing that I wanted to say on that is I agree completely. I mean, what Gilles said is totally true, and is very hard to balance those things. And I usually think that, I basically have about 90 minutes of value for a policymaker, and once you hit that 91st minute, I'm done. I don't have anything else to give, and that's the limit of my ability to give on this. But that doesn't mean that some of you won't, okay? And I don't want to suggest different people do different things. And some people spend their lives, advising graduate students in their office, which it often seems like it feels like my life, and it's a great life in lots of ways. And some people do things that are actually involved in direct policy making for cities, which can also be enormously rewarding. And I just want to make the point, since these are, this is supposed to be an undergraduate event, that working to tame, to humanize, to strengthen the great developing cities of the world is one of the great vocations of the 21st century. And no matter what part, whether or not you end up going to graduate school and writing papers on urban economics models, or working in the mayor of Chicago's office, right? All those things are worthy and important tasks that have the potential to add enormous value.
I engage with policymakers much less than both Gilles and Ed, and partly is by choice, partly is because I guess they're not that interested in what I have to say. But I mean, the little that I do is I do believe that we are at a stage where some of these quantitative models of cities and regions can be helpful in policymaking. Not because they tell you exactly what the answer should be, but as another element in the decision-making process of cities, how to plan these cities, how to plan the urban infrastructure, how to plan transportation infrastructure. I think all cities and all countries should have such a model running the same way the monetary authority has a DSGE model telling them what monetary policy should be. Not because that model is perfect, and not because central bankers follow it to the last decimal point or anything, but because it's another element in the decision-making process. I think that has not happened. Policy is done in a very casual way. I think we can improve on that. And so learning these models and improving these models can help all of you exactly help these cities and this policy making. And so that there's a real value there in terms of improving through economics and what economics has to give through these models.
Thank you. Professor Glaeser, in your 2008 paper, The Greenness of Cities, you and your co-authors explore the environmental benefits of the concentration of people and firms in cities and conclude that low emissions areas restricting development, new development occurs in areas with higher emissions. In addition, many are concerned about how cities trap heat to form urban heat islands. Do you expect the policies governing the growth of cities to change as a result of environmental concerns at all?
So just your summary of the facts was perfect. I'll just restate them. So there are 2 points that we tried to make really with that. One of which was between cities and non-urban areas, carbon emissions were much lower in cities than they were outside. That was coming from 2 sources, one of which is people were just driving a lot less. So this is in the US, where it's primarily about driving, right? So it's not that most Americans are taking public transportation, and it's about smaller housing units. In cities holding income and family size constant. And then the second fact was across metropolitan areas we had this sort of fun paradox that the areas that did the most to restrict new development were those that were most intrinsically green. And they're green, and this is mostly coastal California, the most restricted part of the country, which is intrinsically green not because of any policy, but because of the climate. Okay, because the climate doesn't require the enormous things that Chicago requires, which is a lot of air conditioning in July and August, and a lot of heat in January and February. Now, that would lead you to conclude, if you were like some kind of carbon emissions minimizer, that you really want to do a ton of development in coastal California and do less, consequently, in Chicago. But of course, the environmentalists, who are often some of the strongest anti-growth activists out there, do exactly the opposite. So part of the point of that paper was making the point that, in fact, they had it exactly backwards. And it's not as if good environmentalism meant, just saying no to projects, because every time you say no to a project outside of San Francisco, you sort of turn on the spigot outside of Houston or outside of Oklahoma City. And, from housing affordability perspective for the nation, that's a good thing as well. But from a carbon emissions perspective, you've got to balance these things off. Now, do I see this playing a role? I don't know. Okay, it's not as if, I actually agree very strongly with Esteban's claim that every city should actually have his equivalent of a DSGE running in each city. And I think it's useful to have this data out there, but it's not as if that exactly determines the way the environment filters through to urban policy. But environmentalism is so much part of the rhetoric that, in fact, having a line of research that says, well, cities are actually kind of good for the environment. That research has actually been powerful. I mean, you think about sort of the rise of the YIMBY movement and the sort of split between California environmentalists, many of whom have become pro-urban in the last decade. I think that this type of research is actually useful in terms of that, but not because there's any particular policy that immediately embraces it, but because it enters into the dialogue and it sort of, makes those people who really do care about the environment a little less comfortable saying no to every project in coastal California.
Thank you. We would like to take this time now to open the floor up to questions. There should be a couple of people walking around with microphones, so if you would like to ask a question, I guess.
So first, I'd like to thank the professors for your insights. So my question is, from what I've gathered, it seems as though maximizing the efficiency of cities is inherently at odds with making cities more habitable places for lower income individuals. In your opinion, in the future, will cities necessarily become increasingly inaccessible places for the working class? And if not, what can cities do to make its spaces more accessible for them?
That's probably a question for you, Ed.
Sure.
I'm happy to answer.
Sure. So let's not forget that urban inequality is not new. right? I mean, it was Plato who wrote that, any city of whatever size is always two cities, one a city of the rich and one a city of the poor, and they are always at war with each other. I think it's one of the really important insights of urban economics is that inequality is not necessarily something that cities should apologize for. Cities have rich people and cities have poor people because they are relatively attractive places to be rich and somewhat better places to be poor. And in terms of the poverty of cities is because of better access to social services, better jobs. In the US, access to public transportation, you don't have to have a car for every adult, often ethnic enclaves of various forms. That has been a traditional role of cities in the US and elsewhere. We certainly worry a great deal about how competition for urban space, rising housing affordability has made that difficult. It has made that challenging in many of our most successful cities. Like Esteban, I believe that one answer is to rethink our housing supply policies. So, we're just in a very different place than we were in 1890 when oceans of poor European immigrants came in and were meted by, raising the tenements and building huge amounts of housing to accommodate them. That is certainly one thing that we should be doing. At the very least, we should be, fast-tracking middle-income housing through the permitting process to make this work. And it's not necessarily that poor people will necessarily live in new housing, but that will alleviate competition for older housing. So that's one thing that we can do. But there's another fact which disturbs the heck out of me, which I've been working on with a graduate student at Harvard right now, which is in the Chetty-Hendren, John Friedman opportunity data, cities look pretty bad. Okay? So whether or not you're looking across metropolitan areas, density and upward mobility, or within metropolitan areas, density and upward mobility, or within metropolitan areas, proximity to the city center and upward mobility, or being inside or outside of the central city school district, all of these things, upward mobility looks bad. And cities like Chicago actually look particularly bad in terms of this. And I don't know what the full answer is on this. But the corollary of this notion that cities shouldn't apologize for the inequality is that's really only true if they're also turning poor people into rich people, which is one of the traditional functions of cities. And if we've lost faith that cities are actually doing that, then that in some sense worries me more. And I think we certainly need to have a healthy economics, of cities agenda into trying to understand the Chetty-Friedman facts on this and understand whether or not this is true. And if it is true, what should we be doing different?
In the front again. Oh, just, yeah.
Thank you all for coming. Just wonderful discussion. This is a question specifically for Professor Glaeser. I recently listened to the Freakonomics podcast on rent control, and I'm not going to ask you to give a 30-second pitch on why it's bad, but it seems like I just wanted to preface the question with saying that a lot of the empirical evidence that I've seen, it seems like the short-term effects may be good, but then the long-term effects are bad, and a lot of economists argue that because long-term effects kind of outweigh the short-term, that it's not a good policy. So I was wondering if a city wants to kind of implement that policy, how would you kind of advise a policymaker, or would it even be feasible to implement something like that in the short term and then phase it out in the long term, or would that just have bad repercussions?
So once you implement it, you have a political constituency that wants it forever. So be very careful about that. Remember, rent control begins as a wartime measure to try and eliminate anger at price gouging during World War II. New York City still has it 70 whatever years afterwards, because once you have a large number of renters who are receiving below market rents, they will be voting to keep this thing going perpetually. So let's go through, and a lot of these ideas came right here from the University of Chicago, right? So this is Friedman and Stigler, Roofs or Ceilings, 1948, something like that, the classic thing. Let's go through all the things that go wrong when you turn off a price mechanism, right? There's the classic undersupply, right? The fact that guys don't build. There's the fact that you don't have incentives to maintain the housing. And one of the nice papers on this that's come out in the last 12 years is the work by Parag Pathak and David Otter looking at when you got rid of rent control in Cambridge, in Massachusetts, you saw not just the units that were rent control get better, but the neighboring units got better as well. There was an overall upgrading. So really you see a deterioration of the whole housing stock. And this is what led Assar Lindbeck, a social democrat, mind you, in Sweden, to say, short of bombing, I know of no way to destroy a city that's more effective than rent control, right? When he was talking about his own Sweden. 3, the waste that's given on rent seeking. So, when you're giving away this thing below market rents, people spend huge amounts of time queuing, reading obituary notices, waiting online for this sort of thing. The misallocation of housing, and this is the area that I've worked on myself, there's no sense in which you're making sure that these housing units are giving to the people who value them most. My favorite quote on this was from Kenneth's book, The Streets Were Paved with Gold, where he tells the story of Nat Sherman, tobacconist to the world, who lived in a Central Park West apartment that he was paying something like $200 a month for renting, right? Spectacular apartment. But Nat Sherman says, I think the rent is fair because I use the apartment so rarely. Which means he was only getting $200 of value from it, but there were people who would be willing to pay $2,000. So you're losing $1,800 of value because you're giving this thing to someone who actually doesn't value it very much. And so there are all these things that go wrong when you turn off the price mechanism. And there have got to be better ways to enable, if you want to promote some form of mixing of incomes within a city, there have got to be better ways than doing it in this highly inefficient, typically highly non-targeted way, right? Because very rarely have these things been mixed with, actual proper income, income cutoff. So it's even a kind of stupid way to do income redistribution. And the last thing that goes wrong with income, I'm glad I remember this because D. Gale Johnson's picture is in the building, that one of the great facts from D. Gale Johnson's work on this is a 53 AER paper, was that in New York City in the post-war period, the average income of the landlords was lower than the average income of the tenants. So you were actually redistributing from poorer landlords to richer tenants, which would surely have been true in Cambridge and Somerville for, let's say, graduate students in economics in the 70s and 80s who were renting from middle or lower middle income Canterbridgians owning three-story buildings. Again, you're taking from the poor and giving to the rich with these policies. I think you'd want to do something like a targeted housing voucher for poorer people to keep them in there. If a city wants to go more than just Section 8 housing vouchers, more than doing what it can do with its permitting policy to fast track lower middle income housing, you actually should pay for it, right? You should actually pay for lower rents for people that you want to keep in the city, and you should have an honest talk about what this thing would cost. And I wouldn't say the same thing about the minimum wage, right? That in fact, whatever we think we should be giving to poorer Americans, and I think we should be doing more. I think we should actually, rather than having UBI, I think we should actually be incentivizing work. And we should be doing that with targeted employment subsidies that effectively raise the wage to workers. But it just seems not only is the minimum wage sort of, I still believe, inefficient, but it also is sort of crazy from a fairness perspective that we're gonna work redistribution in this country by asking the people who employ poorer workers to pay for the cost of redistributing to them, rather than saying this is an obligation that all of us should bear. Right, which seems to me like a far juster and reasonable way to think about redistribution. The same thing would be true in terms of housing. Do whatever you think you're doing with general tax revenues rather than screwing up the prices in the market.
So Paul Krugman is calling that zombie ideas. Mm-hmm. And when you're an economist living in the real world, unfortunately, this is something we need to live with. When I finished my PhD in the late 90s, there was a consensus among economists that rent control was a really bad idea. And in the policy world, it was not happening. And 20 years later, it's coming back with a vengeance. And again, we need to go back and argue against and try to kill that. We may win in the end, we may not. Unfortunately, indeed, when control is reinstated, and it's not only in this country, like it came back to France 2 or 3 years ago. They're talking about it in the UK and so on and so forth. So it's a worldwide movement, unfortunately. We may win that battle. Well, yet again, that may last another 20 years, and 20 years later, things will go back. And there's a number of bad ideas like this that keep resurfacing.
I mean, there's the issue that it's a bad idea because the policy instrument is wrong. In some sense, it's not the right policy instrument. I would argue that it's also a bad idea because the objective of the policy is not necessarily the right one. Namely, it's not obvious at all, I think, that we want to subsidize people to stay in those locations. It's not obvious that we want to subsidize people to stay, in particular, in certain occupations, etc., to stay in central San Francisco. We want the programmers there. We want the programmers that can learn from other programmers. We don't want to subsidize people to be there. We want to transfer resources. If we want to subsidize, we want to subsidize them somewhere else, not there. And so that's about the objective of the policy rather than the particular instrument that we're using. Right? It's not, we can't transfer resources. It's perfectly fine to transfer resources to other occupations, less skilled people, poorer individuals in society, but let's not do it by preventing the learning that is happening among, these CNR workers in the centers of our big cities.
Right here.
Thanks again. This is an amazing talk. I'm very happy you guys put this together. I think I'm going to ask a political question because I think we've talked a lot about economics, but we have to translate that into policy. And I think with respect to the last comment, I feel like that's a losing political argument because you're basically arguing for displacement, which is kind of like one of the facets of the crisis that people see. And so I'm wondering, we've talked about the economics and different measures, but how do we take the example of loosening supply restrictions, for example. How do we actually convince policymakers and communities that these are the right approaches? Like, how do we translate these sort of economic ideas into something that's, actually attractive to people who vote and to people who make policy?
Given that you
mentioned
this
him,
policy as a loser, so let me try to defend it. I think there's two points I want to make. First of all, I agree that we obviously want to consider the political aspects and the ability to sell these policies, but we also want to know, what would be the ideal goal? Where do we want to push, right? In what direction we want to push? What Ed was saying, we want to know that direction, and then of course, you need to sell it, and that's part of the problem, and we should consider that part as well. But we also want to know, in terms of efficiency, where do we want to go? Right, so part of our work as economists is to figure that out. That's the first thing. And the other is that when you think about these policies, and you think about optimal policy, these policies in general are very complex, or the optimal policies are in general very complex, and so we have to simplify them in order to sell them. And so that's where the UBI and where we think about transfers to workers outside these cognitive hubs, for example. That's a simple policy. There's a lot of people that are very much in favor of this type of transfers, and they would like to see these transfers maybe implemented, and maybe that's the way you can actually have them implemented, because there's another constituency out there that says, well, we're gaining something too by having our creative hubs or cognitive hubs. And so that's exactly the policy trade-off that you have to where you have this different constituency, and maybe you can bring the constituencies together.
Okay. So first of all, let me just say, so it is so important that Esteban said his thing, because in fact, it is one of the primary jobs of academics who are in the public realm is to say things that are political losers at that point in time. Let me tell you what was a political loser idea, right? Vouchers for schools in 1960. One of the biggest political loser ideas of all time in its day. 50 years later, it's a reality, right? And it is crucial that those of us who are not running for office, who are not trying to be popular, say things that are outside the norm. That being said, right, it is also true that in some cases we have to win battles too, right? So we have to do both things. In terms of and let me make two statements. In terms of actually convincing a suburban neighborhood dominated by homeowners that they want to permit more housing, there is no rhetoric, there is no idea, there's no anything that will convince that group, right? For whom affordability is not a good thing, it's like a decline in the value of their most precious asset. That's a complete, so you just give up on that group. And then you have to figure out where might you make some progress. And I think there's a housing affordability crowd, but I think the hope is with the people who are fundamentally losing from this, who are mainstream, which is basically anyone under the age of 35 who doesn't own. Right? And this is one of the many policies in this country that we have adopted over and over again that basically screws outsiders and entrenches insiders, whether or not it's occupational licensing or land use controls or other rules that have made things harder and harder, or the way we've done Social Security made things easier and easier for people who are north of 50, right, and harder for people who are short of 35. And again, for all of those who are short of 35 in this room, this is a cause worth putting some energy into it. And I think it also relates to one of the puzzles, and from a U of C perspective, it's sort of, I feel it particularly strongly, is one of the puzzles is this rise of socialism fashionable socialism among the young. And on one level, for those of us who do believe in freedom, right, as being sort of a central goal of our society, and utility maximization is really, our formal in economics set about expanding the size of the choice set. It's really nothing about happiness in the way we define it. It's really about, it really, in some sense, can be better defined as liberty or freedom than it can actually happiness. But we have failed so much to make the case that sort of freedom is something that's worth fighting for 20-somethings, relative to thinking that, another name for the philosophy of Karl Marx is something that's worth embracing. And we should be ashamed of ourselves. I mean, we've failed on this. But I think part of the and I've spent a lot of time recently thinking about how to make this case, and I'm not sure I really know about it. I do agree with you strongly that you sort of have to start with the premise that we're not hoping for different things. We want every child to have a brighter future. We want a world in which all Americans are treated with dignity. We want a world in which private entrepreneurs who are going to whether they're nonprofits or for-profits, that they have the freedom and space to do things that are great. And then the question is, what tools are going to get you there, and what tools are going to empower them? And I think there's some sense in which everyone under the age of 25 here has lived through a world in which you've seen the government screw up again and again. Right? Whether or not it's in wars or other forms of economic policy, that you've seen a world of public failure, and you've seen a world of private miracles. Right? You've seen a world in which technology has changed. Half the technologies that you used did not exist when you were born. Right? What part of that would make you think the right answer is dirigist public control of private action? Where would that possibly come out of that experience? And the only thing that I can imagine is that we have failed utterly to make the case for something that is, should be incredibly easy to make, and which our forefathers, right, in which our intellectual grandparents, like Milton and George, right, they made that case. And that to me seems like it's the case ahead, and it's one that's very much talking about the path towards opportunity, towards fairness, comes with freedom, not against it.
There's also a case for thinking. I mean, you, Ed, raised the idea of school vouchers. It was politically unpopular at the time, but it was also a very novel idea, completely outside of the box, and trying to solve a problem of people having to send their kids to a school which had basically no incentive whatsoever to provide really good education. So here, for the problem of NIMBYism and lack of development, I think part of the issue, or one conjecture that I have is, yes, I don't want my neighbor to build a tower in his backyard, because that's going to create a congestion and traffic around my house. So we need to find, maybe there are some tools, new ideas, new ways, new forms of property rights, new ways to incentivize actually everybody, if the benefits of that new development are broadly well distributed, or as well the costs are actually very local, we may want to think long and hard, and maybe there are some solutions outside of the box that work, and it's our job to try to find them, and then we'll send them. There's also an element of, we need to be able to think creatively outside of the box and develop new ideas.
Thank you so much for taking the time to meet with all of us tonight. Your presentations were incredible, and I can definitely say everyone's learned a lot. So thank you so much.